I'm Brian. I think some of you might know me or might have seen me around at Troopers before. I'm finally back, and I'm actually just here to give a little and short talk about VDSL. So as an introduction, I guess most of you know what DSL is and what VDSL is. And this talk isn't really a lot about, well, magic and big exploits and stuff like that. It's rather about stuff that we use every day that we rely on and basically the state of it. You know, these little things that we use every day and we, well, think that they work and they're secure and stuff like that. And just basically to give a little bit of introduction on how things go. There was a slightly similar talk 3 years ago, I guess, at the TelcoSec Day by a good friend, Christian Kagerhuber. Yet again, TelcoSec Day being invite only, just for a closed audience, it didn't really get as much attention as it would have needed. So this time we're here. Great. Well, yes, perfect. I'm a security researcher. I now officially do incident response, though I do actually still prefer to break stuff. Luckily, I do work in a rather complex and crazy, ginormous environment, which is epic to have fun in. And yeah, finally back in Heidelberg and happy to present here. Why VDSL? As said, everybody uses it. Many people rely on it. For me, it's something like, there's a strange user group called parents and grandparents, you know, that used to have something like a normal phone and it worked. And nowadays they actually need an internet connection and a router and whatever else they have to actually make a normal phone call. In emergencies, whatever. And yeah, modern internet is more important than many people actually realize. It's not fun, it's not only work, but it's critical and people really need to have it working at home. Simple questions. Has any one of you ever seen the authentication between his home router and the operator? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good. Has anyone seen, you know, the actual communication that goes out, you know, management communication and stuff like that? Same people? A few more? Okay. Does any one of you actually know the phone calls that you do nowadays via voice over IP, what they look like? You know, whether they're encrypted, authenticated, whatnot, a few more. Okay, but still quite a few people who haven't actually had a chance to look at it. And that's why I'm here. So the basic agenda, the first agenda for today is we've basically got 3 areas. We've got the CPEs, home routers, whatever you've got connected to your interface at home. You've got the DSLAM, which basically is there to combine all the communication of many households, send them back to the operator. And the operator then has very simple stuff like they've got the actual service for the dial-up. They've got the ACS for configuration and provisioning. Nowadays, it's the IMS, which is basically a VoIP core simply for the phone calls. And of course, somewhere we've got the line going wherever for the internet, for surfing and everything that you do every day. Aim for today is to give a quick introduction and to make sure that all of you actually have the tools and know how to be able to, well, check it all out and play with it. About VDSL, well, specs, facts, very high bitrate digital subscriber line, evolved, or subscriber loop, depending on where you are. Modern DSL or modern internet data connectivity via 2-pair or single-pair copper phone lines. Most of the people here, I guess, use it, and the rest probably uses cable, so that's what we all have in Germany. The current version was specified in about 2015, now has something like up to 300 Mbits down and 100 or rather 40 Mbit up. That's what you can buy on the market today. This up here, actually, I love my lab due to having a symmetric 100-100 Mbit line. It's great for playing with, and actually would love to have it on my normal phone line, but sadly it's, well, you get a very fast downlink, but sadly no proper uplink. The DSLAM, I suppose all of you that live in the countryside or a little bit further out of towns have seen those boxes just popping up out of the ground throughout the last 3-4 years. Simply, the problem with DSL is it does need rather high frequencies, and high frequencies don't really work very good on really old copper lines that have been in the ground for 20, 30, 40, 50 years or even longer. So with all the slow DSL, the main issue was that there was far too much noise on the lines. And as it's not really feasible to get the lines into a state that can actually transfer high speeds over long distances, the telco operators go around, put up those boxes where the phone line then terminates. So basically they just have to put a really high power trunk towards those DSLAMs or the outdoor DSLAMs. Your phone lines actually terminate in there, and from there on everything is routed to the back end. From the inside, they do actually look like a big switch. You know, you've got a single port for every single subscriber that you have. Those parts are called line cards. That's usually the thing if you talk to customer support and they say, I'm going to restart the port for you, that's basically a quick reset of the line card. Nothing else. It's, well, magic that it works in some situations, but apparently that's the way to fix stuff. On the other side, we basically have plain Ethernet, or usually a fiber connection. So I'll show you my small lab DSLAM in a second. The aspects that we have, configuration and provisioning. Is that a, yeah. We've got this infamous TR19 protocol that I guess most people here have heard of. About 3 years ago, there was a small worm, a Mirai version that actually made its way through the internet, exploiting stacks of routers, and by accident also managed to DOS telecom routers. So they really had a big major outage. Simple aspect is, if you look at the stuff, well, it's XML. And I guess everybody who's done pen testing knows about XXEs, and everybody who's ever met Sergey Bratos knows the issues of a parser. And you know, the more data you pipe in, it will break. Parsers aren't perfect. And here, especially with the configuration, you know, if you sit in front of a network component and you do all the configuration, you know, IP addresses, host names, whatever baud rates that you can set and stuff like that. You've got very many different data types. They have to be parsed, they've got to be read, and at some point you've got conversion errors. So TR19 isn't really a big problem. It's just, well, complicated. So those are the basics. The second agenda, so what were the main content of the talk, is actually this setup. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to sit down and actually play with DSL. And I wanted to be able to develop tools to actually test on providers' networks. You know, obviously there being various legal issues, but, well, you can work defensively. But you need the possibility to actually, you know, do a man-in-the-middle attack in a lab environment to see whether your stuff works. So what I'm working with is actually split up into 3 parts. So my first part is the actual lab, which emulates the most important parts of an operator's network. So you've got an internet uplink, you've got the ACS for the TR19, all the configuration services, which are both in the same VM. You've got authentication there, which is basic PPP or PPPoE. So you've got a database with users, passwords, and stuff like that. And I've got my first DSLAM. Then I've got my attacker that I work with, yet again another VM. What we're working with is IP. So not a lot of magic, but we'll be talking about that in a second. a second DSLAM. As said, I wanted to be able to have a complete lab setup. So the part on the left is the stuff that you usually don't have. That's at the provider's location. You've got your victim on the right, and then you've got the whole setup for being able to do man-in-the-middle attacks and stuff like that in the middle. For today, I've brought 4 case studies of 4 different routers that we're going to have a short look at, and that's then basically on the other side, the victim part. And those will be the main chapters of today. So, the lab part. The DSLAM is actually a beautiful little box. So it's an AllNet DSLAM. You've been able to buy them on the normal consumer market for about, I guess, 5 to 6 years. They were a little bit more expensive a few years ago. Now AllNet has brought out a new version. And, well, it's luckily dropped in price. eBay is, I think, something like 50 to 60 euro if you're lucky. So, complete setup as said. A few little specs here. Great thing, it runs Linux. It's open, it's got a telnet interface, it's got a UART interface, and actually most of the interesting stuff is controlled via bash scripts. Meaning all the registers that you have in there, you've got a script setting a register and you've got a name for the register. So it's really nice and great to play with, to work with. You can do a little bit of reversing, and you've really got a lot of access to all the single settings. So it's great to play around with and actually to, well, mess with modems, routers, and stuff like that. Basic setup that we have is we've got something like a DSL profile, which is the VDSL2 profile. In Germany, it's usually the profile 17A or 30A. Then we've got to set the NX. I guess all of you know this, NXB, NXJ. Do all of you know what the NX actually is or what it means? Okay. So in communication over a line, you've got a frequency spectrum. And before you had low frequencies, which were single or simple phone lines. And they always used up the whole line. Then DSL was added. And then you had something like this small splitter that you always had. So you went from the wall socket into the splitter, you had the phone on the one side, and you had your router on the other side. And basically what the splitter does is it takes the lower area of the frequency range, which is the analog phone calls, sends it out to the phones, and the higher frequencies basically go out to the routers. So it's the same if you've got a proper audio systems and you've got the loudspeakers for the high frequencies and the bass, and you've got the little filter in between that splits up the frequencies so that it actually does sound good. The splitter on a DSL line is exactly the same. And the NX is exactly the description on which frequencies come out of which socket of the splitter. So obviously nowadays using VDSL and not having analog phone lines anymore, the whole frequency band can be used for DSL, for the digital communication. Whereas before, the lower frequency range had to be cut off, so you weren't able to use it. And above that, you've got different frequencies for the upstream and the downstream. So obviously, you know, on a symmetric line, you'd have something like a 50-50 split up of the spectrum. Whereas on a 100 down and 50 up, you'd have something like a 2/3 and a 1/3 split of the frequency band. So it's rather simple. The filter on that side actually is exactly that feature that you can set. Filter out all the analog phone signals so that the DSLAM doesn't get too much noise and not too much strange signals go in. And the tone mode, which is basically there for the initial setup. So what the DSLAM eventually does is it talks to the router and it actually tells the router, or the modem rather to say, how it actually wants to talk to it. They work out the exact frequency set. I guess you know it from home. If you look into something like a Fritz box, you see the actual speed that was worked out. So that's a handshake between the DSLAM and the router, that they see, you know, how fast can they talk, how fast is the line, and all that stuff is automated in there. Or for us, it's automated in batch script, so we tell it what to do. Yet again, I told you before, there was a nice talk by Christian Kagerhuber 3 years ago. He introduced me to this device. Back then, I sadly paid just over 200 euros for it. Nowadays, 80 euros, so it's great for playing around with. Then the actual provider VM. So yet again, the backend that you usually don't have access to. I use a normal Linux VM, a PPP OE server. Best thing about that one, Roaring Penguin was the only stable one that I was able to find. It has the nice feature to actually just disable login. Basically meaning if the modem comes and says, hey, I want internet, these are my credentials. And if they're encrypted, you can say, yeah, okay, come in, and you're man in the middle. Or otherwise, you go in and it supports PAP. So you say, hey, I'm only able to speak unencrypted authentication. Could you please send your password in plain text? I guess most of you can imagine what the routers do. We'll be talking about that in a second. Then the really complicated thing is, or it's not complicated, it's actually just a big pain in the eye. Modern DSL lines work with various VLANs. So with most operators, the normal internet traffic is in VLAN 7. With telecom, for example, all the entertain, the video streaming is in VLAN 8. And I've got one, I think, O2 router where the payload data is in VLAN 132. Meaning eventually you've got two DSLAMs on the lab setup and the router, and you've basically got two different VLAN 7s. So the switch that I work with is actually a 5-port USB hub with 5 separate network cards, so that I've got separate VLANs on all cards and can do a lot of routing. And if you do actually try this at home and something doesn't work, it will be because of the VLANs. That's something that I learned. They never really work out. Then the second part of the operator is the ACS, the auto configuration server. As said, using the infamous TR19, XML and SOAP format. The communication doesn't really work the way that the ACS is able to push data to the router. So the router calls home. So it goes there, says, hey, do you have any information for me? The only thing that the ACS can do is the callback that I've got down there. And as said, nice XXEs and stuff like that. It's injection, it's normal. Quickest way for a lab setup with TR069 is, was on the slide before, Genie ACS, open source tool to work with it, and start with a Fritzbox. Because the great thing about AVM is that they've documented their complete API on the routers. There's nice documentation. They use the TR064 protocol, which is a configuration protocol that you basically use from the internal home network to configure your router if you want to. And if you use a small script, you go in, you tell the Fritzbox where the ACS server is, it will connect, then it will start getting data. So that's really nice to have a first fuzzing victim, get your lab up and running, and start playing around with. So this has said, that's all that we need for the lab. VM, PPP, little bit of VLAN, and have an ACS so that we've got something to attack. You can actually expand the whole thing. If you want to do some VoIP, set up something like an asterisk, reroute voice traffic and play with that. But that's something, there are enough talks on VoIP and zip, and there's been a presentation on Troopers in the NGI that I'll be referring to in a second. Everybody knows how it works. Then we've got the attacker part. We've got one modem on the one side, for which I usually use a Fritzbox. It runs in PPP pass-through mode, basically meaning that I'm able to have normal PPP dial-in traffic that comes into Fritzbox via LAN, and the Fritzbox will just send it out to the actual operator and just pipe it through. Thus, it's good to terminate. Otherwise, you can just use a normal stupid DSL modem, and I can tell you it's next to impossible to nowadays buy a modem. And don't go into one of those shops and ask them, they'll ask you what a modem is. And they won't be able to understand why you actually don't want a router, because routers are better, they've got more functionality and stuff like that. For me, it's an Ubuntu VM, a few little tools on there and stuff to play with. To play with TR19, all that you need is actually, you've got to be able to get this callback URL, passive sniffing. You see how the operator does it, you do the same eventually. Pen testing a router with TR19 is really, it's not a lot of fun due to the fact that you can't go and send data. Meaning you've got your payload list, you do a callback request to the router, it calls back, fetches the payload, executes it, and then you need a way to find out whether it's still working. So obviously it's a bit of IoT testing. You need some automated way to go in, check the power supply, see how much current it draws, see if the LEDs are blinking, something is going mad and stuff like that. As soon as you've done that, you trigger the next callback, it calls back again, iterate the payload and stuff like that. So it's easy to do, but you do need a setup if you actually want to do it automatically. And for everybody who's ever used Burp and the intruder, you don't want to do all those requests by hand. It's simply not a lot of fun, and if you don't automate properly, that's what you're stuck with here. Port scanning, yet again, VLANs. You're in the wrong VLAN, you won't be able to reach the box. One main issue with doing port scans on these routers is that very often configuration ports are bound to certain source IPs. Meaning that even if you've got the IP of the box, you go in, you do a scan, ports won't be open, or they'll appear not to be open, unless you've got the actual IPs where the operator usually comes from. So first step here, always passive sniffing, see what the operator does, start spoofing those IP addresses, or simply give the IP address to your own box, and well, you're able to do everything on the boxes that the operator can. Basic lab setup, the way things go. This is a scan of a telecom router. As you can see, zip is open, or that's at least what they've got on 5070, and port 7547, the port for the ICS. In the telecom router that I tested, it wasn't bound to a source port, but it was authenticated. Then zip traffic. The easiest thing for me to do is to refer to Fatih's work. He's been at Troopers a few times. I guess many of you have seen his talks on VoIP wars. VoIP is VoIP, play with it, intercept stuff. Everybody who's seen zip traffic and things like that, it's XML. You inject stuff, you break stuff, it always works. Even on the operators' networks, obviously, they're secure, nobody plays with them, so there's still a lot of things to do and to play with and to find. And of course, Wireshark is great. Even if you've got something like a phone call that you've sniffed, Wireshark will give you all the audio data so you can listen into the call and stuff like that. So that's yet again great both for learning and also obviously for offensive work. Backend access is a little bit of an issue. It is a productive running operator's network. It's not your network. You won't be allowed to access it and to do anything with it. So you've got to be defensive, whatever defensive means. So just the hint, if you've got a setup like that, don't break anything. You don't necessarily know how old the stuff is that you're talking to. So. Attack chapter, that's the part of it, it's short, it's all IP. And for me, it doesn't make any sense to stand down here and to actually tell you how to play with IP, because that's, I guess, our everyday business. And with the moment that you've got something like a DSLAM and you terminate all the communication from a router, that's all that it is. You go back to use your old tools that you have. TR069, it's SOAP, it's XML, you use Burp. Audio is zip, you use something like vPoint, stuff like that, and that's all that you need. So it's, well, easy to attack, easy to play with. And from there on, we'll be going into the victims. A short sorry at this point. I'd love to, in the next chapter, just open Wireshark up, scroll through all the sniffs that I've got, show you everything that I found. But due to the fact that my sniffs were done in productive systems at homes of friends of mine, so obviously there's their zip dial-in and their phone numbers in there. I think they'd hate me if I put their numbers up here. So we've got a little bit of ugly screenshots, but you'll get the point. And if anybody afterwards does need a productive sniff, we can work something out. Or as said, invest €80 and do it yourself. It's easy as that. The first box that I looked at was obviously German operators, Vodafone EasyBox 904 XDSL, manufactured by Astoria Networks. It's been on the market since 2015. I bought it on eBay. You know the way things go. I think it cost me about €2. I hooked it up to my DSLAM. I did a little bit of sniffing. On my first try, I had accidentally misconfigured my PPP server. So it went into CHAP authentication and it ran into an error. Then I went in and had another look and I went down to no login and it just basically got an IP address via DHCP. Because yet again, it's DSL, it's normal IP. And if you don't use PPP authentication, it will fall back to normal DHCP. So something that we can work with and actually use. Then I had a look and I activated PAP. And it gave me the basic hard-coded authentication material that's on a Vodafone EasyBox. So the R44220227, that's the serial number, that's the username. And basically the password is the ACS AKA. And the way the authentication with these EasyBoxes work is they don't come provisioned and you don't really get, so they're back from the day when you didn't have the written right to use any router on your own internet connection. So there were a few companies saying, you know, you can use our router, none else. So they hard-coded credentials and they didn't give you your passwords to log on with every hardware that you wanted. And that's basically from those days. So all that they gave you was a so-called MIC, a modem initialization code. So it was I think it was a 20-digit number that you have to dial in. Then it will use this number, run to the configuration server, say this is the setup code that I've got, and fetch all the configuration data. As I obviously got it from eBay, I didn't have a MIC. I sadly wasn't able to find one on the internet. And well, for my quick setup, I initially started with Burp. You know, if you use the intruder and just iterate all 20-digit numbers, I think it took me about 2 minutes and I had a working one. So it came out and said, hey, that's my initialization code. I hope nobody's actually got the same code, but it comes from Burp, it's not my fault. Afterwards, I actually went for the more complicated way and, you know, download the firmware image from the internet, open it, use Kata or simply Radar, open the DLL or the SO file that is actually used to check the MIC, reverse the code, write a keygen. But sad part about it, I sadly didn't find anybody in my, well, direct friends area who had a Vodafone internet connection with XDSL. So sadly, I wasn't able to do a sniff there. But luckily, having a few friends on O2, that's where I went next. Yet again, a box from Astoria Networks, yet again eBay. It seems the guy who sold it didn't actually wipe the box. So I guess those are actually his old internet access credentials that he had on the box. I wiped it afterwards and it dropped down to using the pass just zeros. So funnily enough, actually, all the Wi-Fi and stuff like that was seemingly set back, but the internet credentials weren't, so no idea what they did, but that's the way stuff like that looks. Yet again extracted by telling the box, hey, I can only speak unauthenticated authentication or unencrypted authentication. Please send me your clear text password. You've got it. Easy as that. Then I went to visit a good friend with his EasyBox 6641. I forgot to take a picture of his device, sadly, but it's currently on the market. It's still being sold. It's running. And so I hooked up into the line, his productive line between his router and the O2 network, completely passively. I didn't inject anything or whatever. I just did a little bit of sniffing. And you go in, and the first thing that you have is PPP authentication. So that's on the live network. It runs in. It's just got to see. Yeah, it yet again uses PEP on the productive network. So they do only send the stuff unencryptedly. I'll be talking about the actual realistic attack vectors on that at the end of the talk. So, you know, it is actually really a closed circuit network, and it is really hard for an attacker to get in between your router and the operator's network. So just because it's an unencrypted password at that point, it's not the end of the world, but it's still interesting to see. And the most fun thing, the authentication ACK message, pedo, melon, amino. Anybody here who can translate it? Exactly. So it's actually Elvish. It's from Lord of the Rings. Don't ask me why. There seem to be some nerds at O2. I did really like that response. I've got no idea how many people have actually seen it, but...
Is friend the password then?
Sorry?
Is friend the password then?
No, it's actually the I think it's an 8-digit password, sadly. So it's just an Elvish response. What I actually didn't quite understand was being on O2, let's see if I can get my mouse here, the DTAG reply, which is actually Deutsche Telekom AG. And I actually thought I was sniffing on an O2 network. I'm not quite sure yet where it comes from. I have heard at some point that apparently there is a little bit of contracting and a little bit of shifting, but I've got no idea. Well, interesting stuff that you find. So after the authentication, as I said, unencrypted. You've got the next part. You've got the zip register. Obviously, everything, well, it's normal zip traffic. Normal digest authentication, so sadly no way of actually extracting the password. We just see all the authentication data. Here, of course, I did wipe it, friend's phone number. It's zip. And we're man in the middle between the trusted router in our home and the operator's network. So there have been situations where companies come from the old world, you know, it's my network, it's a wired network, and nobody's got the technology to actually be able to attack a phone line and stuff like that. But now it's IP, and even though it's their router, and to do all this, I didn't touch the router. Well, I unplugged the cable and put another cable in, but that's it. I didn't open it, I didn't do anything else. And I've got full access to that communication, and I can play with it and I can change it. So I can't really imagine that there's been too much testing. Obviously, the companies do security, but everybody knows what the world looks like. Other fun parts, apparently the router, so he's only got one phone number configured, but there seems to be some other default configuration. Trying to register with change me. Now, just think about something. If every single O2 router has 2 default profiles, and most customers only have one phone number that they put in, and every router has a second profile that runs towards the zip backend every few minutes trying to authenticate and saying, hey, it's me, change me, let me in. Simply the amount of data that they produce and the amount of requests, you know, it's unnecessarily. And it's not really that nicely configured. I didn't get out the passwords. I think it wasn't even directly authenticated, so it's actually just running in. Then, going back home, the first telecom speedport router that I got, This is the model that was mainly affected during the 2016, I think, attacks by this Mirai branch that I talked about. Back then, it wasn't a vulnerability within the telecom routers. The attack was made for a different router model, but the routers actually had I think it was a small memory overflow due to far too many requests. So all the attacks basically just DOSed the devices, and it wasn't really a vulnerability within them. That's why I bought it back then. Yet again, I plugged it in. The first thing that it does, it requests a DHCP IP address on VLAN 8. If you give it that IP address, nothing else. So it's no open ports or anything. So that sadly was a boring feature. Then you've got the dial-in. So this is a sniff that I did in my lab. That's basically what the dial-in looks like. It goes in, it brings its vendor class identifier. Yet again, the same way that you've got it in DHCP, you've got the vendor parameters. It goes in and then pushes back some kind of configuration URL via DHCP. PPP does exactly the same. Basic configuration. It comes up, it receives an IP address, and then it starts talking to the backend. My favorite part of the communication was telecom DNS. I've got no idea why they do it. I guess, did you all see the fun part? Just look at the caps and the characters. It doesn't only do that for telecom servers. It could be that they've got them hard-coded in some fancy, strange way. But actually, every DNS request that goes out from that box looks like that with messed up caps. I actually thought it would be a really nice way for doing a little bit of side channel data extraction. And I thought if it might be something like that, but I simply don't have a data set to look at it. And I honestly can't imagine that telecom is side channeling out data via DNS. Why should they? Then yet again, zip register. Interesting part here. The username that you have is always anonymous. So the actual user ID only comes from the from header. So yet again, something that's live environment, I didn't try it, but it does give you the potential of playing around with valid credentials that might work for anonymous, playing with different from phone numbers and seeing whether you can get in. As said, potential, nothing else. Then we've got the update check, so it runs to an ACS server, gets an XML file with all the update files, and that's basically a list of all the firmware images that are available from Deutsche Telekom to the routers. The digest that you've got is actually just an MD5 checksum. Then my final router and my favorite one. So this router actually ruined my last weekend, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. It came on the market mid-2018, I think something like July. It's basically, the speed port is the consumer router, and this Digitalisierungsbox, the digitalization box, is the corporate router that they sell. Produced by Zixel, it supports one of the new fancy features by Telecom, which is the auto configuration. Basically meaning Telecom will use your line ID. So as said in the DSLAM, you've got a unique port that your line is plugged into. Telecom knows which user is on which line, so they basically know who's talking to them. It's hardwired, so it's not really easy to reroute stuff, so it is secure. And the concept of these routers nowadays is you plug them in, and they work. And for everybody who's ever looked at auto configuration mechanisms, they never really do what you expect. They do work, but they do stuff in strange ways. So this obviously was, for me, the perfect device to get and to have a look at. And that's what we're going to do now. Initial login. It comes up with this longer number, 5200. That's the normal format of a telecom customer number, or the user ID that you have. The 00 01 used to be basically the node ID that you were able to set if you had multiple devices on your end. And the other thing is a normal customer ID format. Obviously, it's not my customer ID because that's what's hard-coded on the device. It then uses a standard credential called setup, which makes sense. You know, go in anonymously, get provisioning data, and then see on from there. Yet again, VLAN 7, and I also, as it was a telecom router, had the same part of the VLAN 8 for entertain, so nothing really surprising. Then you've got the communication with the ACS. It calls back to the advanced configuration server. It's encrypted. It uses client certificates. This is the moment where until Friday I wanted to say client certificates, you know guys, that's a great job for an operator. That's exactly the stuff that we haven't seen for years. Usually everybody goes in, uses normal SSL, logs in, and everybody does a man in the middle through either compromised certificates or anything else. This client certificate handshake was really nice. Remember the wars. Automatic configuration, as said, it goes there, it gets configuration data, it reconfigures itself. That's basically the setting that you've got in the customer interface. And yeah, well, it's encrypted. We can't see what it does, which is a little bit sad, but it's expected. While I was actually making the slides, I was actually documenting some of my work in the slide set with some notes. The device, where is it? Actually reconnected again and came back up with the credentials, a different user number, and setup NG, next generation. So seemingly the box went in a standard mode, talked to the backend, said, hey, I've got basic functionality. And the backend said, hey, here's your new data. So that's the new login data that we requested. So sorry for skipping that slide. Some of the communication that we saw there with the ACS, the multiple connections, is probably the zip communication. Because after the initial setup, you know, the phone light on the router goes green and you're able to do phone calls. I had a look at the manual, and the manual says that this box supports a protocol called TR104, which is basically a TR069 addition expansion that can be used for exactly VoIP configuration. Makes sense, you know, different fields, different data, information on encoding and stuff like that. So the router supports it, and that's what I thought it was. It did 3 connections to the ACS in the period of time where it would have made sense. And I've got 3 different phone numbers configured in my profile. Could be accidental, but it does look like a pattern. Yet again, still sadly encrypted. Yeah, we had the setup NG. Then later in the lab, you know, I had the setup NG part. I took it off the line, I took it back to the lab, I plugged it in. I had all the credentials set up in my own backend, and it tried to log in with the next version. Then it's going from normal setup to setup NG to setup XLS. So they've got a 3rd login profile with yet again a different user ID. It's still not the one that I've set in my customer interface, but it could also be that, you know, they give you something like a unique ID for the device. It's, well, interesting. I've only seen that behavior at telecom, and only with this router. Yet again, it's one of the most modern boxes that they have, and it might just well be the easy and quick way. Then it actually fell back to setup. So there seems to be some kind of login mechanism and the communication home. What I think it is the device comes in, logs in with this XLS profile, and connects to the ACS and says, hey, it's me, and give you my configuration. Then it goes back, it logs back in with the setup XLS, and the ACS actually tries to call back to the router. But due to the fact that at that point I had the router in my lab network, the ACS wasn't able to do the callback. So it possibly actually told the router, hey, I've reconfigured you, but I can't reach you anymore now. So drop back to the default profile, which yet again makes sense, different situations, different configuration profiles. So setup seems to be the basic default one, and then it goes up depending on the router's functionality. Updates, yet again, it's the same mechanism. The updates are, as many people who've ever looked at embedded devices, they're not encrypted, but they're signed. Valid approach. That's all that you need. Then the remote configuration. So nowadays you've got the option to actually configure your router from the operator's web interface. So you log into the customer interface on the internet and you configure the boxes in your hall, which for some people might feel a little bit iffy. If you do it, it's very simple. You see a callback from the internet. It triggers a TR069 connection, connects back to telecom, and fetches new configuration data. For me, it's handy, ran into an error, so I wasn't able to play with it. No idea why. But the most fun thing, has any one of you noticed the HTTP client? A Jakarta common HTTP client? Does any one of you know when it was taken out of support? I think it was 2011. So whatever ACS they're running, it might make sense to do a little bit of pen testing on it. I don't want to say that Deutsche Telekom does a bad job at security or anything like that, but it is old equipment, and old equipment does tend to have certain issues. And probably many of the people there aren't really realizing that there are guys out there looking at this stuff and playing with it. Then something that I had for my to-do list, there was a CLDAP request that actually came from a telecom IP address to my router. And it's a request for a root element. I'm not exactly sure what it is yet. I think it might be a part of the phone book component that's in the router. So that there's a way to actually synchronize your phone book from your customer interface to the router and stuff like that. Yet again, CLDAP doesn't really feel like the best protocol to do something like it. The port isn't open on the router, but the request is there, so also interesting. Then came my last Friday. So I've done quite a lot of hardware security, and there was a client certificate, and I somehow had the feeling that somebody would ask me whether I tried to extract it. And I've already had a look at quite a few telecom routers, and I know that they do usually close UART interfaces. So I didn't want to go any deeper. The talk isn't about the hardware, it's about the DSL, it's about teaching skills, showing you how to work with that stuff. So my idea was, open the screws, go in, check that the UART is dead, close it, talk done. That was basically while doing my quality assurance and my final spin. I opened the device, I saw 4 pin headers looking out that were actually already soldered to the device. I connected to it, and I had a root shell. So instead of verifying that it's closed, I landed with an open root shell. So I was kind of, before the talk, forced to actually look into it, which I then had to. It's a busy box. As said, it's a direct root shell. You've got the U-boot, you've got the full access menu there. Directly in the boot output, you've got your ACS authentication string. Great. It was protected before, now I can see it. The GUI authentication is the password that you actually need to get into the device via the admin interface. I couldn't stop at that point, so I had to carry on. All the configuration on the device is in SQLite tables. I actually, nowadays I was too lazy to do too much with it. There was luckily Netcat installed. So I piped all the configuration data via Netcat onto my laptop and worked with it. For those who might have seen it on Twitter, I was actually at some point fighting with this stupid encrypted client certificate. That's actually a part of the private key. The field for the password is empty, so I'm not really sure yet how it is protected, but it's there and it's sitting duck. I went so far to actually pipe devmen via ncat into an image on a different machine. it works. It's ugly, but yeah, that's the callback URL that actually Telecom uses to reach the router. We've got all the ACS connection parameters. So the yellow part, that's what the router uses when actually logging into the Telecom ACS server. The orange part is the part that the Telecom ACS uses to log into my router. Plain text, sitting duck. So actually, even though that looks like a hash, that's the password, you know, just to make sure. It's plain text, it's nothing else. That's the configuration stuff. So they've got a strange, as said, it's all SQLite databases. I played with it. I reversed the scripts a little bit, and I simply told the router to connect to my ACS, so that I was able to do some fuzzing. I was a little bit disappointed, and that's luckily the point where I can get to the end. You know, it's 2019, and we've still got root shells on routers locally via UART. I think at some point in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, we decided that that wasn't best practice. And that maybe if you've got something like a client certificate, you don't want to have it being sitting duck on the device. So DSL environments are great. They're great to have fun with. You can still do loads of stuff with it. Equipment is that cheap. I'm still going to explore all the possibilities with the DSLAM. I'm not even through half of the batch scripts. There's still a lot to do. And so for the final part, as said, everything that we talked about isn't magic, but it's also not the end of the world. We've got secure phone lines, or the phone lines are in the ground. You can't necessarily access them. But in Germany, we've got a very fun thing on old houses, which is the main input of the phone line. So that's actually what on many older houses, the phone line going into the house looks like. You know, you take off the cap, you put in your DSLAM and your modem, and so you're on the line, and you get all the configuration data, and you can steal it and take it. Or if you're living something in like a multi-tenant house, and you have access to the cellar, you go in and you get access to the internet configuration of all tenants, and well, I hope that's something for you to take home and maybe consider in some of your research, and maybe if you implement something like that or play with it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Are there any questions? Okay, up there. Let's see how I can make it.
Hi. Just a small remark. You noticed that DTAG in the O2 line.
Yep.
Telefonica discontinued their VDSL service about a year ago. I was one of those guys completely disconnected because Telecom can't provide something there. So all O2 VDSLs are now DTAG. So it's pretty much Telecom technology with a O2 flavor.
Thanks, perfect. That's the most trivial question, reply, or yeah, good.
Okay, thanks. Any more questions? Okay.
There's another one right down here.
Yes.
Hi. Besides exposing URT, as usual, were they exposing also JTAG, or at least JTAG was not that easy to find on the PCB?
I didn't.
You didn't need, but I just wondered if...
Follow me on Twitter, I'll tell you at the weekend.
Roger that. Thank you.
Yeah.
More questions from the audience?
Then, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank our speaker again.